I watched Sloane Harrington look at Evan Calloway the way a person looks at a delivery van blocking a driveway. And then I heard her tell the security officer that his name was not on the guest list. Minutes later, the Yacht slid away from the dock carrying investors, champagne, and the soft laughter of people amused by a single father left standing on the pier. Out on the open water, a warning that man had already put in writing began coming true. Water found the engine room. Lights stuttered. The hull leaned. And when everyone ran for daylight, Sloane was trapped below, and the only person who turned back was Evan. If you love stories where decency outlasts arrogance, stay with me, because this reversal earns every single second of your attention tonight. The marina at Greyport was at its best in the last hour before sunset, and Aurelia sat at the deep-water berth, like a building that had learned to float. 210 feet of white steel and glass, $60 million of it, freshly refitted for a company that badly needed the world to believe it had changed. Evan Calloway walked up the boardwalk in a canvas work jacket, with a tool bag on his shoulder and a folder of printouts under his arm, and I could feel the crowd part around him without anyone actually stepping aside. He was 38, and he had the stillness that comes from years of doing dangerous work slowly and correctly. 11 years earlier, he had been pulling fishermen off a capsized trawler in a Coast Guard rescue swimmer's harness. Now he was the marine systems lead on the most important vessel his employer owned, which in practice meant he crawled through service passages in the dark, while other people talked about brand positioning in conference rooms. He did not own a tuxedo. He owned a daughter named Sadie, 11 years old, currently doing homework at a neighbor's kitchen table, and a pickup truck with 190,000 miles on it. He had spent that entire day finishing the final walkdown, and the walkdown had gone badly in the quiet way that frightens engineers more than loud failures do. The high water sensor in the main engine space had cycled twice without cause, reporting wet when the bilge was dry. The isolation valve on the seawater cooling line, the valve whose only job in the world was to slam shut and stop the ocean from coming inside, had answered its command signal late on one attempt and not at all on another. And the backup dewatering pump, the machine you reach for when the first machine loses, had failed its final flow test that morning and had been reset rather than repaired. Any one of those things alone would have been a maintenance ticket. All three together, on the same system, on the same night, were a sentence he had learned to read. So he had written it out plainly, the way he had been taught to write things that might someday be read by an investigator instead of a manager. 3 findings, 3 photographs, 1 recommendation, in capital letters at the top of the second page. Do not sail until emergency dewatering and seawater isolation are retested and verified. He had sent it at 14 minutes past 9 that morning to 3 people, and he had received nothing back but a 1-line acknowledgement from an assistant. Now he carried the paper copy under his arm, because paper does not get lost in a mailbox, and because he had learned somewhere in his 30s that the only warnings that count are the ones you can hold up in your hand. He climbed the boardwalk steps looking for the one man on that dock who could still stop the evening. Preston Winthrop found him first, which was not an accident, because Preston had been watching the parking lot for exactly this. The chief operating officer was 48, silver at the temples, wearing the kind of dinner jacket that fits so well it looks like a natural skin, and he had the easy voice of a family that had been rich long enough to stop mentioning it. He took Evan gently by the elbow and steered him behind a stack of dock crates before the folder could be visible from the passerelle. He said the technical team had already been through this, that the summary had gone up the chain, that everyone appreciated the diligence. He said the word diligence the way you say the name of a dog. And he said that 30 investors and 4 board members were already on board, and that nobody was going to unwind an evening 2 years in the making over a sensor with a loose connection. That was when Sloane Harrington came down the dock, and the light on the water seemed to reorganize itself around her the way it always did. She was 42, 3rd generation, and she had grown up watching her grandfather sign for hulls with a fountain pen in rooms where nobody spoke until he did. She was not stupid. She was, by every measure the market cared about, excellent. The executive who had dragged a tired family firm into 2 profitable years, and a rebrand that was finally about to pay. But she had one flaw that had never cost her anything before that night, and it was this. She read people from the outside in, starting with the fabric, and by the time she reached the substance, she had usually already finished deciding. She looked at Evan's canvas jacket, and his scuffed boots, and the folder under his arm, and she turned to Preston as though the man himself were somewhere else. "Is he coming too?" she asked, and she asked it the way you ask whether the tarps have been ordered. Preston said carefully that Captain Briggs had added Calloway to the manifest as Marine Systems lead. Sloan asked for a pen, and the events coordinator produced a paper copy of the list, because that is what you do when Sloan Harrington asks for a pen. She drew a single line through his name, and she wrote 4 words beside it in her small, precise hand. Remove, crew, and support only. Then she added her initials, the way she initialed everything, out of a habit so old it had stopped being a decision. She handed the page back without any cruelty in her face at all, which is somehow worse, because cruelty at least requires you to see a person. Evan stood there, holding a report about a valve that would not close, while the woman who could have stopped the vessel decided where he belonged on a piece of paper. The quartet found its first chord behind them. Somewhere on the upper deck a cork came out of a bottle, and 3 people applauded. "You can ride out on the support tender if engineering wants coverage," Sloan said, still not quite looking at him. "But you won't be boarding Aurelia as a guest. Tonight is for the people building the future of this company." I have replayed what he said next many times, and what strikes me is how quiet it was, because a louder man would have been easier to dismiss. Evan said, "Then you should keep the people who can guarantee the ship is still floating in that future." The air on that section of dock changed temperature. Preston made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, the practiced noise of a man distancing himself from a subordinate in real time. 2 of the guests near the passerelle turned to look, and I watched them arrange their faces into the particular amusement that wealthy people reserve for a workman who has said something out of turn. One of them repeated the line to his wife, and she smiled into her glass. Evan said no. He said the sensor was one of 3 findings, and that the 3 findings all belonged to one system, and that he did not need any of them to be catastrophic on its own. He needed them to be simultaneous, which they were. He said the retest would take 4 hours, that the tender could ferry guests to the harbor restaurant in the meantime, and that Aurelia could sail at dawn with everything verified. It was the most reasonable thing anyone said on that dock all evening, and it did not matter at all. Sloan told the coordinator that the departure would proceed as scheduled, and she walked up the passerelle without saying goodbye, and the string quartet started properly, as if it had been waiting for her heel to hit the deck. Preston lingered just long enough to tell Evan that he had done the right thing by flagging it, and that they would circle back Monday. And I want to note that Preston knew precisely how much of a lie that was. Evan did not argue. He walked instead to the base of the bridge wing ladder and asked for Captain Owen Briggs. And when the captain came down, the 2 men had a conversation lasting under 2 minutes that would eventually cost a chief operating officer his career. Evan asked him to enter it in the log. Not a complaint, not a protest, just the sentence, in the deck log, with a timestamp. The support tender was named Tern, a 42-foot aluminum workboat with a crash rescue package, a small crane, and a crew of 4, and Evan boarded her with his tool bag and his folder while the party above him laughed at something he could not hear. He stowed the folder in a dry bag out of a habit older than his career. His phone buzzed in his jacket, and it was Sadie, who had seen photographs of the yacht in the company newsletter and had strong opinions about the swimming pool on the aft deck. "Do you get to eat dinner on the pretty boat?" she wrote, followed by 3 exclamation points and a fish. Evan looked up at Aurelia, blazing with light against a purple sky, every window gold, the quartet drifting out over the black water like something out of a film about a world he had spent his whole life keeping afloat from underneath. "No," he typed, "I'm working tonight. Save me half the brownie." Aurelia's lines came off at 4 minutes past 8. She swung her bow into the channel with the delicacy of a very large animal, and the guests along the rail lifted their glasses at the marina crowd, and the crowd lifted their phones back. Turn fell in astern at 300 yards, which was where a support tender belongs, and Evan stood at her transom rail, watching the yacht accelerate away, and felt the first cold thing move through his chest. Because from behind, in the flat evening light, with the wake spreading out in two long feathers, he could see something that nobody standing on that beautiful teak deck could possibly see. She was sitting low. Not dramatically, not the kind of thing a passenger would notice, but a hand's width lower on the starboard quarter than she had been sitting when he climbed off her at 6 o'clock that afternoon. At 8:41, a second engineer named Marcus went down to the engine space on a routine round and found half an inch of water moving across the deck plates. Half an inch is nothing. Half an inch on a ship is a mop and a report. But it was warm and it was salt, and it was moving forward with the pitch of the hull instead of pooling aft where a washdown would have pooled, and Marcus had 8 years at sea, and he did not like it. He called the bridge. Briggs asked him to trace it, and he started tracing it, and while he was tracing it, the high water alarm, enunciated on the console, held for 6 seconds and cleared itself. Just as it had done twice that afternoon, in the report nobody had opened. Evan's radio call reached the bridge at 8:44. He asked Briggs directly whether the engine space had enunciated anything in the last hour. There was a pause on the channel that told him everything before Briggs answered, and Briggs, to his credit, did not soften it. One brief high water alarm, self-cleared, engineer investigating. Evan told him, in the calm, flat cadence of a man reading a checklist, to reduce to bare steerage, close watertight boundaries, put a second engineer in the space with a flashlight and not a console, and turn back toward Grayport, not evacuate, not panic. Turn around slowly and go home while going home was still a 20-minute problem. Briggs said stand by and reached for the internal phone, because he was required to inform the principals aboard. Preston took that call in the passageway outside the galley, and I want to describe his face precisely, because it is the hinge the entire story turns on. He was not surprised. That is the thing. He heard the words high water alarm, and his expression did not move toward shock. It moved toward calculation, the look of a man confirming a risk he had already privately priced. He told Briggs that the vessel had experienced a sensor fault that morning, that it was a known nuisance alarm, that the engineering department had cleared it, and that he was not going to allow a flickering light to end an event on which the company's entire recapitalization depended. He used the number 400 million. Then he said the sentence he would be asked to explain under oath twice. Turn this boat around and we lose the raise. Sloane came out of the salon at the sound of his voice, and she asked what was happening. And here is where I have to be honest about her, because it would be easy to make this simple. Preston told her it was the same sensor from the morning report, the one flagged as a minor irregularity, the one she had approved to be handled after the event. And she believed him, because it matched the only document she had actually read, and because the man in the work jacket who had tried to tell her otherwise had already been categorized as a technician using safety language for leverage. She thought for perhaps 5 seconds. Then she told Briggs to continue for 20 more minutes. Complete the demonstration, turn past the lighthouse where the photographs had been planned, and then head in early, if it would make everyone comfortable. She also said one more thing, and it is the sentence that would eventually be read aloud at a board hearing. She told the chief steward that under no circumstances was the word evacuation to be used in front of guests. She meant it kindly. She meant do not frighten 30 people over a light bulb. But I have learned that language is a kind of infrastructure, and when you remove a word from a ship, you have removed a tool from the people who might need it in 9 minutes. Briggs put the phone down, looked at his first officer, and quietly began doing everything Evan had asked for anyway. Because a captain can slow a ship without permission, even when he cannot turn one around. He rang down for reduced speed. He sent his second engineer below with a flashlight. At 8:52, 300 feet below the piano, a flanged coupling on the seawater cooling line let go. It had been weeping for 11 days, a thread of moisture nobody had photographed, and the vibration of a full-speed run had walked the last of the bolt tension out of it. The failure was not dramatic. A 4-inch line under the pressure of the sea does not explode. it simply becomes an open door, and the ocean does not need to hurry. 2,800 gallons a minute came into the engine space through a hole a man could put his fist through. Marcus was 30 feet away and was knocked flat by nothing but the sound. Everything that happened next was supposed to be survivable, and it would have been if one valve had worked. The isolation valve upstream of that coupling exists precisely for this event. Marcus hit the console command and the valve reported travel and did not travel, exactly as it had failed to travel that afternoon in Evan's test, and the number in the corner of the screen kept saying open while the ocean kept agreeing with it. He went for the manual override, which is a hand wheel on a stand behind the main sea chest, and by the time he reached it, the water was at his knees and rising against him, and the hand wheel needed 40 turns. He got 11. Then the water reached the lower switchboard, and the compartment went dark, and Marcus went up the ladder with his flashlight in his teeth, and he was the last man out of that space, and he had done everything right. In the salon, 30 champagne glasses went off a table together, and a party turned into 41 people in a leaning box. Turn was already closing. Evan had seen the general alarm strobe activate before the radio traffic reached him, and he had his exposure suit half on before the tender's skipper finished turning. What I want you to understand is that he felt no satisfaction, not a flicker. I looked because I expected to find some, and there was none. And I have thought about that a great deal since. There was a small door in him that had been shut for 11 years, and it opened, and behind it was every drill, and every checklist, and every cold night in a helicopter basket, and the man who had stood on a dock being told he was support staff became the most qualified human being within 20 nautical miles. He picked up the radio and began giving instructions, and Briggs, hearing them, put the handset on the loudhailer so the whole bridge could work off one voice. Close the boundary at frame 62 before you lose the ability to dog it, Evan said. Do not restore power to the aft switchboard. Get the tender fenders over on your starboard quarter, because your list will make the port side unreachable in 5 minutes. Send 2 crew to break out the portable pump, but do not send them below frame 62 for any reason. Muster your guests on the port bridge deck, high and forward, and count them by name off the manifest, not by looking at a crowd. He said all of it in short, flat sentences with pauses for acknowledgement, and I noticed that the crew of Aurelia had already stopped waiting for anyone in a dinner jacket to speak. Authority had relocated itself, quietly in about 90 seconds, to whoever was making sense. Preston made one last attempt to run the evening. He told Briggs that transferring guests to a workboat in front of witnesses would put images in circulation that would destroy the company. That the vessel had watertight compartments. That they should hold everyone aboard until the Coast Guard arrived with something presentable. Briggs turned around from the chart table and looked at him for 2 full seconds. Then he said quietly the sentence that ended Preston Winthrop's authority forever. This stopped being your event when the water came in, and it has always been my ship. He detailed his first officer to escort the chief operating officer to the bridge deck and to make sure he stayed there. Then he began the transfer. She was 2 decks down, in the owner's conference room aft of the lower lobby, and she had gone there for the most human reason imaginable. When the alarm sounded, she had taken 2 investors below to retrieve the signed term sheets from the table where they had been left, because in the first 90 seconds, she still believed she was managing an embarrassment rather than a sinking. The 2 men got out. She stopped to gather the folders. In that gap, the list went from 6 degrees to 9, and a decorative cabinet 11 feet long and bolted for aesthetics rather than for sea walked out of its footing and came down across the passageway, and the lobby door forward of it lost power and defaulted to its emergency state, which on that deck meant closed. So the woman who had drawn a line through a man's name stood in a red-lit room, with a door that would not open and heard, through the deck plating, the specific sound that a ship makes when it is deciding to become something else. Water came under the aft bulkhead in a sheet, warm and utterly black, and covered her shoes, and then her ankles, in less time than it takes to describe. She hit the door with the heel of her hand and shouted, and the sound of her own voice frightened her more than the water did, because there was nothing in it that anyone would obey. She had spent 20 years building a voice that changed rooms. It changed nothing at all down there. I think that is the moment she actually understood the size of what she had done, and it came to her before any rescue did. On turn, Evan heard the count come back one short and heard the name, and one of the deckhands beside him said what half the harbor would have said. "That's the woman who wouldn't let you on the boat." Evan was already pulling the harness through his legs. He said, without any particular weight, "That doesn't change where she is." Then he told the skipper to lay Turn's shoulder against Aurelia's starboard quarter and hold her there, which was a genuinely dangerous request because the two hulls were rolling out of phase and the gap between them was opening and closing 4 feet at a time. He went across on the third close with a line, a light, and a portable radio, and I watched him land on a deck that was tilted like a roof. He did not try to fight it, and this is the part that saved her life. 6 months earlier, during the refit, Evan had spent 4 days crawling the service passages behind that deck to route cable for the new fire panel, on his elbows, in the dark, alone, doing the unglamorous work that no photograph is ever taken of. He knew there was an access hatch behind the laundry that ran outboard of the conference room and came out at a service door in its aft corner, a door that existed so a technician could reach a chilled water manifold. It was 22 inches wide. It was above the waterline by perhaps a foot, and it would not be for long. He turned and went back up 4 steps and forward, and Ruiz followed him without asking a single question, which is its own kind of courage. They found the laundry, and they found the hatch, and Evan went through it flat, with the light in his teeth. On the other side, in a space smelling of detergent and diesel, he could hear her hitting the door with something metal in a rhythm of 3. Which meant that somewhere in her panic, she had remembered the oldest signal there is. He put his hand flat on the door and called her name once, and then he said, "Is anyone in there?" Because the human voice needs a question to answer. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'm here, I'm here." "Are you standing?" he asked. "Is the water above your knees?" There was a pause with water in it. Then she said, "Who is this?" "Calloway," he said, and started working the door. "I know," Evan said. "I'm coming in the back. Get away from the aft corner and put your back against the forward wall." The service door was dogged with 3 lever handles, and 2 of them came over with the heel of his hand, and the third had bent in its frame as the hull worked and had to be driven with a pry bar he took off Ruiz. It gave with a bang, and at exactly that moment, deep and far aft, something structural let go with a long tearing crack that traveled through the whole hull like a struck bell, and the list went from 9 degrees to 12 in the space of a breath. Water came into the passage behind them in a surge that took Evan to his waist and slammed the pry bar out of his hand. Ruiz shouted from the hatch. Evan got the door open and put his light on her. She was standing in water to mid-thigh in a $2,000 dress, holding a folder of term sheets against her chest with both arms, and her face was the face of a person who has been away from her own body for a while. Evan did not say anything about the folder. He came in, took the life jacket off his shoulder, and put it on her the way you dress a child, one arm, and then the other, pulling the straps and setting the buckles, himself because he could see her hands were not going to manage buckles. Then he clipped a harness line from her jacket to the loop at his own hip, and put both his hands flat on either side of her head and turned her face to his light. "Look at me," he said. "Not at the water. At me. I'm going to say 4 things," he said. "You're going to do them in order, and I'm not going to explain any of them until we're outside. Do you understand?" She nodded. She could not speak, and she nodded. 1. You go through that door on your knees, not your feet. 2. You keep your left hand on the line the whole time and you do not grab me. 3. If I stop, you stop and you wait. 4. Whatever you are holding right now, you put it down." And she looked at the folder in her arms, and something in her face came back, and she said, "There are signed documents in here. They're the only." "There is nothing in this room worth you not getting out of it," Evan said, not harshly, almost gently, and that was somehow the thing that broke her. She opened her arms and the folder went into the water, and $400 million of paper turned gray and began to drift toward the corner. And she went through the door on her knees. The service passage was 22 inches wide, and the water was climbing it, and the ship was rolling further with every set. and it took them 9 minutes to cover 90 feet. Once she stopped completely, in the dark, with the water at her ribs, and simply could not make herself move, and he did not shout at her. He told her to say her own name out loud. She said it. He told her to say it again and take one step, and she did, and then another, and that is how they crossed the last 30 feet, one step per syllable, while the ocean came up behind them. At the ladder he clipped her line short and put her hands on the rails, and put himself directly beneath her. They came out onto the bridge deck into wind and spray, and the strobes of 2 Coast Guard boats standing off at 100 yards, with turn hard against the starboard quarter, rising and falling 6 feet on every swell. The transfer took 3 attempts. Twice the gap opened at the wrong instant, and Evan pulled her back by the harness without ceremony, and the 3rd time he counted her down out loud, 3, 2, 1, and she went across into the arms of 2 men she had never met and would remember for the rest of her life. Evan came after her on the following swell. 20 seconds later, Turn's skipper put the throttles down and backed away, and at 4 minutes past 10, 7 miles off Greyport Light, Aurelia went down by the stern in about 90 feet of water. She did not go quickly, and she did not go quietly. Her bow came up out of the sea, white and enormous, hung there for a long moment lit by 4 searchlights, and then went under, and the sound that came up afterward was the sound of a great deal of air leaving a very expensive room. "I don't know what to say," she said. Evan looked up. He was not cold with her, and he was not warm with her. He said, "Then don't say anything yet." And he went back to the ankle. There was one more thing on that deck that mattered, and almost nobody saw it. Preston Winthrop stood near the wheelhouse door in a ruined dinner jacket, and he was looking at Evan Calloway with an expression that was not gratitude and was not relief. It was fear, plain and specific and entirely rational. And it had nothing to do with the sea, because Preston was the only person aboard that boat who already knew exactly how tonight would be reconstructed. He knew what was in a document he had opened at 22 minutes past 9 that morning. He knew what he had removed from it before passing it upward, and he knew, watching that soaked man tape an ice pack to a deckhand's leg, that the original was sitting in a mail server with a timestamp on it, and that it would be read aloud by somebody. Aurelia experienced a rare and wholly unforeseeable mechanical failure, it said. Our crew's exemplary response ensured that every guest was brought safely ashore. Evan read it on his phone at his kitchen table at 6:15 with Sadie asleep upstairs and his boots still wet by the door, and he read the word unforeseeable 4 times. He was not an angry man by disposition. But I watched something settle in him at that table that was harder and more permanent than anger, because he understood that the sentence was not merely false, it was load-bearing. If the failure was unforeseeable, then no warning existed. If no warning existed, then no one ignored one. And if no one ignored one, the next Aurelia would be built and sailed by exactly the same people, in exactly the same way. The legal department reached him at 9 that morning with 2 attorneys, a folder, and an offer built by people who are very good at this. A retention bonus, a 4-year contract, a senior title, full indemnity, and a mutual confidentiality agreement to be signed before any conversation with investigators. Evan read all 11 pages at his kitchen table while they drank his coffee, which took 20 minutes, and nobody interrupted him. Then he pushed it back across the table and said no. He told them he had no interest in talking to any journalist, that he had already declined 4 requests that morning, and that they were welcome to put that in writing if it helped. But he said that if a federal investigator asked him a question, he was going to answer it completely, and that no amount of money on earth was going to make him rehearse a smaller version of the truth. One of the attorneys asked, carefully, whether he had retained the original report. Evan said that he had, that so had the mail server, and that so, he suspected, had they. Sloane heard about the meeting that afternoon, and she came to find him at the salvage staging yard where the recovery contractors had set up, and she came alone, driving herself in jeans, with the bruise on her arm gone purple. She had been out of the water for 30 hours, and she had not yet slept, and she was still, in a way she could not see, running the only program she had ever been given. She found him at a table of recovered equipment, and she said, "I can fix this." "You can't fix a report after the ship is on the bottom," Evan said. She asked him what he wanted. She meant it sincerely, and that was the tragedy of it. Money, she asked. A position. A public apology on the record from her personally, in whatever words he chose. She said it quickly, listing instruments, because instruments were what she had. And Evan set down the piece of valve actuator he was holding, and looked at her for a long moment. And then he asked her the only question he had actually wanted answered since 8 o'clock the previous evening. "I want to know how 3 words became a maintenance note," he said. "I wrote 'Do not sail' on the second page in capital letters at 9:14 yesterday morning. You made a decision at 6 that evening. So I want to know what those 3 words looked like by the time they reached your desk." And Sloane, who was very intelligent and very tired, went absolutely still, because she knew the answer to that question, and she had never once thought about it. The document she had reviewed before the event, on her tablet, in the car, was a 5-line summary forwarded by her chief operating officer. She could see it. She could see the entire sentence. Minor sensor irregularity. Maintenance can continue after event, no impact to schedule. She had read those 14 words and she had felt nothing at all about them. And she had moved on, and there had been a paperclip icon at the bottom of that message that she had not touched. The internal review convened on a Thursday in a conference room with the blinds down, and Natalie reconstructed the day from timestamps, the way a surveyor reconstructs a boundary. 9:14, report delivered. 4 pages, 3 photographs, 1 recommendation in capitals. 9:22, Preston Winthrop opens the attachment and remains in the document for 11 minutes. 9:31, Preston forwards a 5-line summary to Sloane Harrington and Owen Briggs, attachment included, characterization changed. 9:34, Sloane opens the message on a mobile device for 8 seconds and does not open the attachment. 10:06, an assistant's calendar note records a request from the Chief Operating Officer's office to the technical group, asking whether the outstanding items could be closed administratively before 1800. Captain Briggs testified for 50 minutes and never once raised his voice. He produced the deck log, and he read the line he had written in his own hand at 7:51 in the evening, and the room listened to a sentence that had cost nothing to write and would now cost several careers. Evan Calloway recommended vessel remain docked pending emergency system retest. He said that he had received the summary, not the report. He said that when he had spoken to Calloway on the dock, he had understood the concern to be serious. And he said, when Natalie asked him why he had sailed anyway, the truest and saddest thing anyone said in that room. Because a master can refuse to sail, and every master knows what happens to the next master who does. Then Natalie put up the guest list, and I do not think anybody in that room had anticipated that a piece of party administration would become the central exhibit in a marine casualty review. There were 2 versions in the events file. Version 1, generated at 11 that morning, contained a line reading Evan Calloway, Marine Systems Lead, and a table assignment. Version 4, generated at 6:38 that evening, contained the same line with a strike through it, and beside it, in a hand everyone in the building could identify, 4 words and 2 initials. Remove, crew and support only, SH. Sloane looked at her own initials on the screen for a long time. She had initialed perhaps 400 documents that month. This one had taken her under 3 seconds, and she had not thought about it again until the water reached her knees, and what Natalie said next was said without any drama at all, which made it worse. She said the strike-through was not being introduced as evidence of rudeness. She said it was being introduced because it established, in writing, with a timestamp, the reviewing executive's classification of the person whose warning she then declined to read, 90 minutes before departure. Attitude, Natalie said, is not usually documentable. Here it was documented. Preston made his stand and it lasted about 6 minutes. He argued, with real skill, that the engineer's own conduct undermined the engineer's own claim. If Calloway genuinely believed the vessel was unsafe, he asked the room, why did he not stop it by every means available? Why not call the Coast Guard? Why not stand on the passerelle and refuse to move? A man who truly believed a ship would sink does not send a memorandum and then get on a support tender. He let that sit, and it landed, and 2 directors shifted in their chairs. Because it is a genuinely persuasive question if you have never worked for anyone. Evan answered it from the end of the table, without any heat whatsoever. He said that an engineer has no authority to detain a vessel, that he had used every channel that existed, which were a written report to 3 executives, a verbal escalation to the chief operating officer, a verbal escalation to the chief executive, and a formal entry in the deck log. Then he said the sentence that Natalie Pierce later told me she wrote down verbatim in her own notes. An engineer cannot hold a ship at the dock. A chief executive can delay a party. The room was silent for a good 4 seconds, and Preston Winthrop did not attempt a second question. The board met the following Tuesday, and this time Evan's name was on the notice. First, above the directors, listed as principal witness. I want to hold on that for a moment, because 11 days earlier he had stood outside a velvet rope on a dock while people in dinner jackets walked past him, and now he walked through the glass doors on the 14th floor of the Harrington building, and a receptionist stood up and said, "Good morning, Mr. Calloway. They're expecting you." Nobody stopped him. Nobody asked what he was there to fix. There was a chair set out at the head of the table beside the chief counsel, and a glass of water in front of it, and his name on a card. He sat down in the seat the company's chief executive had once decided he was not entitled to occupy. Preston went first, and it did not go well for him. He spoke in the passive voice for 11 minutes about characterization, materiality, and reasonable operational judgment, and Natalie let him finish before putting the server logs on the screen. The document he had opened. The 11 minutes he had spent inside it. The summary he had composed. The specific deletion of the phrase "do not sail," and its replacement with "maintenance can continue after event." The request to the technical group to close outstanding items administratively. He was suspended pending termination before lunch and referred, along with the entire file, to the federal investigators and to the district attorney, and he left the building with a security escort carrying a box that a lawyer had already checked. Then it was Sloane's turn, and she could have survived it. I want to be very clear about that, because it is the whole measure of her. She had a chief operating officer who had falsified a summary, a documented deception, a paper trail that pointed away from her, and a public narrative in which she was a survivor pulled from a sinking ship. Any competent crisis counsel would have told her to sit still and let Preston take all of it. She stood up instead, and she spoke for 6 minutes without notes, and she did not use the word unforeseeable. She said that Preston Winthrop had concealed material information from her, and that she would cooperate fully with every proceeding regarding it. Then she said the rest. She said that the report had been in her mailbox for 8 hours and that she had not opened it. She said that she had spoken with the engineer who wrote it, face to face, on the dock 90 minutes before departure, and that he had told her clearly that 3 related systems had failed and that 4 hours of testing would resolve it. She said she had heard leverage instead of information because of the jacket he was wearing. She said she had ordered the vessel to continue for 20 additional minutes after a high water alarm, because photographs had been scheduled at the lighthouse. And she said that she had struck his name off a guest list in her own hand, and that the same man had come back into the ship for her. The board deliberated for 2 hours and voted 11-1. Sloane Harrington was removed as Chief Executive Officer effective immediately, with her family stock holdings intact and a directorship she declined the following morning. The resolution language was unusually direct, and it said what needed saying: that the failure was not one of technical knowledge but of governance, and that a chief executive cannot require 4,200 employees to honor a safety standard she has personally overridden for the sake of an evening's optics. She was not removed for nearly dying. She was removed because she had made herself the reason a warning could not reach her, and no amount of courage afterward could unmake that. Aurelia came up in pieces over the following 6 weeks, and the coupling and the isolation valve went to a federal laboratory in sealed crates. Harrington Maritime settled with its insurers, survived, and became for a while the most closely examined shipbuilder in America. And in the 3rd month, the board did something that no crisis consultant recommended, and that turned out to be the single best decision the company made that year. They offered Evan Calloway the job of Director of Maritime Safety and Reliability, reporting directly to the board rather than to any operating officer. He did not accept it in the meeting. He asked for a week, and he came back with 3 conditions written on 1 page, and he said the job was not worth having without them. First, that the lead engineer on any vessel holds an independent stop-sail authority that cannot be overruled by any executive, only reviewed afterward by the board. Second, that no safety finding may be reclassified, summarized, or downgraded without the counter-signature of the engineer who raised it. Third, that every safety report is deposited automatically and unalterably into the board's own document system at the moment of filing, visible to the directors without passing through any executive's hands. The board approved all 3 in under an hour, and I have since watched 2 other companies quietly copy the language. Sloan came to see him once more, at the marina, on the last afternoon before she cleared out her office. No security detail, no assistant, no car waiting with the engine running, just a woman in a coat standing on a dock in November, looking at an empty berth. She said she was not there to ask for anything. Then she said she owed him an apology, and that she had rewritten it about 9 times because every version she tried was really an apology to herself. She did not say, "I'm sorry I crossed your name off the list." She said, "I'm sorry that I thought where your name sat on a page told me what your words were worth." Evan accepted it. He did not embrace her. He did not tell her it was fine, and he did not offer her friendship, because none of that would have been true. And I would like to note that this is the rarest kind of ending. Some things are not repaired, they are only understood. He told her that he thought she would be all right, and that he hoped she would say all of it out loud somewhere it might do some good. Because there were about 400 people running maritime companies in this country who needed to hear it from someone like her rather than someone like him. She said she would think about it. She did, eventually, in front of a Senate subcommittee, and it was extraordinary. Then she walked back up the dock, and he went back to work. 4 months later, on a bright cold morning in March, a new hull sat at the deepwater berth at Greyport with her sea trial, scheduled for 11 o'clock. An assistant brought Evan the boarding manifest on a clipboard, and he took it and looked down at it, and I watched him read it twice. The first name on the list was not an investor. It was not a director, and it was not a chief executive. The list began with captain, then engineering, then safety crew, then emergency support, and the guests and the observers and the people in good coats were all grouped below, under a heading that read supernumerary. That ordering had been his second act as director, and it had taken 1 memorandum and no argument at all. His phone buzzed in his jacket. Sadie, 12 now and merciless, had seen the trial on his calendar. "Are you on the list this time?" she wrote. Evan took a photograph of the page and sent it to her, and his own name sat there in plain type just under the safety group, which was exactly where it belonged and exactly where he wanted it. He looked at it for about 2 seconds, which was all it deserved, and then he put the phone away and turned to the young engineer, waiting at the top of the gangway with a tablet in her hands, and asked the only question that had ever actually mattered. Did all the final tests pass? She hesitated, and I could see her weighing the 11 o'clock schedule, and the 2 directors already on the dock, and the photographer setting up by the bow, the way people in her position have been weighing such things for 100 years. Then she said that one high-level sensor in the forward bilge was giving an intermittent reading, and that she was 90% sure it was a wiring fault, and that she would like 4 hours to be certain. "Then she doesn't leave the dock today," Evan said, and that was all. There was no argument, no phone call from an executive floor, no man in a dinner jacket explaining what the delay would cost. The photographer packed up. The directors went to lunch. A crew of 4 opened a panel and began tracing a wire, and the vessel sat exactly where she was, floating, with every person who would ever sail on her still alive, because the man they had once left standing on the pier now held the only signature that mattered.